when I think about the built environment and new technologies influencing it, I think the way we design buildings with more people in mind and the way we can open up new possibilities using algorithms to say, here's a novel way of imagining this space, imagining this building that not just optimizes for the financial flows, but actually optimizes for the people experience will be very interesting. I don't know what the hospital of the future looks like, but I sure hope it's going to be designed by an algorithm.
Hi, everybody. This is How Tech Becomes Law, a public interest tech podcast about technology, public policy, and career advice. We are your co-hosts, Jinyan Zhang and Dhruv Gupta. This week, we have a conversation with Raja Ghawi from Suffolk Tech about the role that tech is playing in construction, housing, and the future of our physical spaces.
Raja Ghawi is the investment director of Suffolk Tech, a VC investing in new technologies and business models, innovating the way we build and the spaces that we live in, work in, and play in. Prior to Suffolk Tech, Raja was consulting with McKinsey, focusing on growth and M&A, advising clients in multi-billion-dollar software, fintech, and industrial acquisitions. He studied bioengineering at Harvard College. So Raja, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks for having me, guys. And thanks for the great intro. A little bit more about myself. I've been in venture capital for 2-3 years now, mostly investing in what we call Contech and PropTech, construction technology and property technology. Basically, construction is one of the least productive industries in the US, according to McKinsey. And also some of the least digitized. So it's construction, agriculture, and hunting. So at Suffolk, we recognize that problem. And we also see a lot of technology tailwinds coming to disrupt this about $4 trillion contributor to US economy annually. Now that we have increasing amounts of data on the construction side and also on the property side, AI and ML have a lot of advancements that really help the industry as you're moving away from paper-based industry to something that's more digital. Industry is very visual as well. You look at a building, you look at a wall and you say, this is complete or incomplete, right or wrong. That drives all kinds of workflows. Image recognition is only catching up right now to say, here's an image of an incomplete wall. I'm actually going to build a black box that's smart enough to detect that and then trigger all kinds of workflows downstream from it. Hardware is also becoming much more commoditized. If you go back 4 or 5 years ago, something like a Boston Dynamics robot is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now you can build use case specific robots with tens of thousands of dollars from off the shelf equipment that you can procure super easily. And the innovation just becomes on the AI. How do you control it? How do you make sure it doesn't task well? How do you make sure it doesn't bump into people or fall off the stairs, right? You also have a lot of millennials and Gen Zs enter the industry. You finally have a lot of people who've used technology all their lives and say, why am I holding a P&L on paper? Why is it not digital? Why am I signing things at my desk? Why can't I do it from my phone? Oh, there's a tool that does that now? Okay, I'm actually going to spend $1 on it. I'm going to take that risk that it's going to work, as opposed to being very risk averse and saying, like, I've built high rises with pen and paper my entire career. I don't need this. It's like, I'm going to try. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, I'll find another solution. I'll move on and that's fine. But there's this demand for technology that's starting in the industry that wasn't there 5-10 years ago, which is very encouraging. The last thing to mention is there is what I think of as the greening of the world. If you talk to very senior folks who are financing and building buildings, they say, we want our buildings to be more energy efficient, to be more green, as much as we can have the same financial returns. And you talk to folks in the field, they say, we don't want to be as wasteful. Like, why have so many water leaks? Why have so much material damage if you can avoid it? We look at that opportunity at Suffolk and we say, wow, this seems like the right time to go and invest in technology that is disrupting the space, right?
I'm going to just jump right in. Can you talk a little bit about a few of the firms and companies that you've invested in?
Very happy to. One of our earliest investments was in a company called OpenSpace. What OpenSpace does is you get this small GoPro, you put it on your hard hat and you go and you walk your site. And all you have to do is on your phone say, like, I'm on this floor, and it can track exactly where you walked and map it all to the floor plan. So the experience of viewing the photos after a first capture feels very much like a Google Street View. You can drop a pin and walk around your site. And then you walk once a week, multiple times a week. And over time, you build this visual record of your site. One or you can wind time back and see what's behind the wall because you have a photo of the wall before it got closed down. The problem it's solving is if you want to do that before something like open space came around, somebody had to show up with their phone and go and take photos of every single floor and then go and spend 5 hours just categorizing that. And then good luck differentiating between the second room on the 10th floor and the second room on the 50th floor and all the second rooms that look exactly like them in a big tower. And even if you're doing a multifamily building, townhouses in a neighborhood, they also all look the same. Something like open space becomes a very easy way to save time and documentation. It's a great system of record for images. And now that they have all that data, what they're starting to do is say, look, a big part of people's job in construction is say what's complete and what's incomplete. And you have someone going and like counting all the fixtures, counting all the outlets, making sure that all the walls are done. Let's just automate that because we have now enough data to train some machine vision algorithm to go and do that for us. So all you have to do is just see the output and say like, okay, I agree with this. This number looks weird. Let me go and see the photos and spacing it off of. I agree or disagree. And you're automating a lot of expertise that way and saving people a ton of time, making their jobs so much easier. We were investors in their Series A. They recently announced their Series C. Jeevan over there is doing a phenomenal job leading a great team. Basically trying to just create that image system of record that for a visual industry we didn't have before. Another company that we invested in is called Agora. They help electricians procure materials just more easily. You have a lot of very small electricians. It's a very fragmented industry. And then you have a lot of fragmentation on the supplier side as well, where they buy all these materials. You go and you say, okay, I want to do an RFQ for copper wiring and commodity. You can get 5-7% price variation just because there's a lot of opacity. The market is not efficient at all. So what Agora is doing today is saying, look, instead of calling your buddy and just getting whatever price they have at hand right now, we'll just help you A, digitize the process, and B, just do RFQs. So not just one or two people you know and trust, but to everybody in your area. And over time, what that does is it just creates more pricing transparency for everybody involved, makes the market much more efficient. And we're going to start with this one trade, electricians, and then we're going to go to mechanical. We're going to go to plumbing. We're going to go to all the trades one after the other. We also invested in the company last year in their Series A. They just announced their Series B this past week. Maria over there is also doing a very phenomenal job trying to basically bring more transparency and bridge that gap between supply and demand. Those are just two examples of recent successes. We tend to gravitate towards software, but not everything we invest in is software.
No, that's great. The question that I wanted to ask here was, in particular, you've identified a lot of different problems here while speaking earlier that the industry is facing. The technologies that you talked about kind of seem to fit this gap between really senior level folks that might not be tech adopters and a lot of young folks entering the market that grew up around tech like us and are looking for those kinds of solutions. Is that where you think the market is going and how you think you'll fill these problems of labor shortage to maximize productivity efficiency?
Just sort of adding on to that, I'm just kind of curious in your take, because you mentioned that generational gap. And do you see it also as possibly some tensions between different generations of workers in terms of like what that future of the sector looks like and the kind of skill sets and kind of training that's needed to enter the industry, which historically hasn't necessarily been to say that you have to be an expert technologist to work in construction?
Right. I think these are great questions. The first thing to say is the generational shift that we're seeing means there's a larger portion of young people who are willing to try technology versus a smaller portion who are more senior. There are always a lot of senior folks who are very excited to try new things. The industry is structured in a way that makes everybody a shield. Everybody's risk averse. So if you're building a building, delivering or over delivering is not really rewarded above and beyond what your contract says, but under delivering is severely punished. So everybody who grew up in the industry, their instinct, their training, the contractual obligations they're under mean that they can't take risks on as much because the downside is just too big. What we're seeing right now is as these technologies are maturing, they're actually solving real problems and they're not as risky as what somebody might think looking at them being the first person to try them. The generational shift then becomes that folks who are younger are more willing to try new things and take on that risk. But once it's proven out, it's a very type A industry. You see somebody doing something, you see it working, you want to make sure that you get ahead of it. So that's why something like Procore, for example, at first people are like, what is this? Am I actually going to move away from having all my contracts here next to me in this drawer? When it's proved out, it's become the industry's default. We're starting to see that with open space, with some of their competitors, with other systems in the industry. While there might be you might need to go and find the right champion at first, but once the product proves itself, adoption picks up very, very quickly.
Do you expect construction tech to start bringing up that labor productivity in a way that we've seen in other industries, or is it really just an employment and labor problem?
So I think it will in two distinct ways. The first one will be automating expertise. Going back to the open space example, you needed someone who's very senior to walk the site and say, I spot all the issues here, and here's the long list of what I need fixed. If you can have a computer do 80 or 90% of that, then that saves you 80, 90% of the work needed. So that's one way. And there are examples of that in design. There are examples of that in how you quality assurance, quality control, how do you schedule planning. The other one is just straight out labor automation. So we're starting to see that in two different ways. The first one is modular and offsite manufacturing, where you basically set up a factory and you either build different subsystems and ship them to the site, or in some examples, you build an entire 1-2-story house, put it on a truck and move it to where it needs to land. The other one's robotics on site. One of our portfolio companies is called Canvas. They built a robot that can do drywall finishing, which is the step you need before you paint. It takes about 5 days to complete. And what it is you put up a bunch of sheets and then you have to just sand them over and over and over again, laying on layers of materials and waiting for them to dry. So it's 5 days of somebody just going up and down, up and down, up and down. Very taxing on the body, very repetitive. You talk to the union leaders for the drywall finishing folks, and they're losing membership because nobody wants to do this. Enter Canvas with a robot that does this. They're a member of the union in the Bay Area. Everybody goes out and says, well, I'm 18, 19-year-old, maybe just getting apprentice or out of some vocational school. I can be a roboticist. I'm working with this robot with this new piece of machinery, and I'm overseeing it. And then the more sort of middle managers and more senior folks who've been in the industry for a while, they look at it and say, well, this is the new tool. This is the future. I also want to get trained at it. And that gets people much more excited to enter the labor market again, because they're not just doing manual or repetitive tasks. They're actually working with robots. So cool, right? And they're also in the forefront of cutting down a cycle from 5 days to 1. So you can do even more work with just the time you have.
So this technology, a lot of this technology, even like Canvas, isn't replacing current jobs. It's not like automation is leading to unemployment here. In fact, it seems like it's increasing productivity.
It's not, for two reasons. The first one is there's just so much that we need to build. We don't have enough people. So when somebody comes and automates a task, they're not taking away from work. They're basically taking away from like the pipeline of things that have waited for 1 to 2 years that there was just nobody to do. And then these robots, these factories, these machines are not fully autonomous. You still need someone to come and do the work. And oftentimes they're designed and built in a way where your traditional labor can be upskilled fairly quickly and be able to do it themselves. So you are creating new kinds of jobs, really. You're not taking away work. The classic examples I like to mention is when we built excavators 60, 70 years ago, nobody said you're taking away work from the guys with the shovels, right? But you still need someone to operate the excavator. So it's just a new kind of job that needs a new kind of training that's popping up in the industry. And because of the massive labor shortage that we have, you're not taking work away from anybody. You're just helping people finish the work they have faster so they can go on to their next job and next job and next job, because the pipeline is just so big.
In your experience, where for Suffolk Construction itself, for the most part, it does primarily new construction, thinking with it is the criticism that you could make things faster and better or construct it faster, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually lowering emissions or ultimately the amount of pollution that's being generated based on per unit of housing that you're creating.
Right. I think you're right. I think the last number I saw was construction is the largest contributor to global house gas emissions, about 30% of it. And the built environment is the largest consumer of energy, about 40% across the globe. The challenge has been that while a lot of folks building buildings at different scales want to lower their energy impact, they also have different financial metrics they want to hit. And there's no financial incentive to go green in many places just yet. But we're starting to see that shift, both because of certain regulations. Like in Europe, for example, there's a lot of regulation around waste out of your site, where you want to make sure you can recycle everything. So everything leaving your site needs to be tagged and reported on a certain way. And there are actually some interesting technology starting there to help with that waste management aspect of it. And in the US, we've mostly seen it in terms of energy efficiency and trying to spec that in. On the call it simpler side of builds, cross-laminated timber is much more energy friendly, and a lot of folks are trying to build with it. It does have some size constraints. Again, you need concrete to go high, and you need to go high in most urban places. I think as soon as environmentally friendly materials, A, become economically feasible, and B, structurally feasible, it'll become a no-brainer. People will move over. Because the costs are so high, and oftentimes when you're building a building, you have a pro forma, you have an IRR hurdle you need to hit. We've seen people sacrifice on the margins of the environmental in order to just meet their targets. The other side of that is the industry is full of shields. If you are an engineer and somebody comes and says, here's a new sort of concrete and it has a much lower carbon footprint, please spec it in. They're going to say, like, what happens if it doesn't work? Have you ever used it in a building of this size with these parameters? Why should I take this risk? Like, I can not just lose my license, I can end up in jail, and like a lot of people might die, right? So I think you'll start seeing some of that material innovation, non-structural aspect. And then as folks test it out and get more comfortable with it, it might scale up to be a larger and larger portion of what we build. But that's going to take time because you need someone to trust it on a small scale, try it for several years, validate that it actually works, that it's actually safe, and then do that on larger and more structurally complex types of builds. So I think that's a long-term journey. It's also just very encouraging that a lot of people are trying to generate that new kind of concrete, play with new kind of materials today. So when the market is ready for them, hopefully they'll be there.
But at the moment, you still have to either pay a premium out of interest or because of regulation. And so this might be where, in your view, policy has to step in to either subsidize or push the industry towards certain types of materials. Or do you think like maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see that economic incentive?
I think policy would be helpful, but if investors just come and say, if your building meets these energy efficiency metrics, we will give you the debt portion that you need to build this building at more favorable rates. I think that could drive the industry forward a lot. And you're starting to see the BlackRocks of the world talk about their environmental mandate and how they want to push that down. So I think there might be some fairly sizable opportunities for the financiers of the built environment to come and say, we want you to build more energy efficient, more environmentally friendly types of buildings, and we'll help subsidize that for you because we just believe in it. The government might also be able to help with that, green bonds or a version of that for the environment. Haven't seen that as much yet, but I would imagine if somebody would come and tell you, here's 1 or 2 points off your debt interest, now go build green, feels like a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, it makes sense. And so this is all on the construction side of this and where we're seeing differences in materials and in technologies and such. But there's also this regulatory side, right? Where you have things like parking minimums, or you have various zoning laws that exclude multifamily homes or duplexes or triplexes, et cetera. As we see a shift here and we see more and more, focus on expanding out from just single family home zoning or moving towards transit oriented development, et cetera, are you seeing a shift in the industry as well?
I think it's a parallel track for now. So there is the urban planning level that you talk about. Let's design cities that have more public transit, that can accommodate less cars. Maybe even in Europe, they ban cars from certain downtown areas as well, to just lower the carbon footprint of people using our cities. Where companies like Cul-de-sac out in Arizona are trying to build larger complexes that are designed for people to navigate through without cars.
Yeah.
But there is definitely a demand. There's a market for that. The other place where the regulation would work, so not on the more urban planning area, but at the building itself level, would be somewhere like New York. Local law 97 there basically requires a 40% drop in GHG emissions by 2030 and an 80% drop by 2050 for existing buildings, which covers about 50,000 assets in the city alone. Which means that if you own a building in Manhattan over a certain size, you now have between today and 2030 to go and retrofit it and make it more energy efficient and drop your GHG emissions. So that's an example where regulation is going to put a lot more costs on the current owners, operators of these buildings. You're seeing other kinds of regulations in places like California when it comes to car regulations. You want to phase out gasoline-powered cars by 2035. To your point around just how you navigate, traverse the built environment. But again, it becomes this thing where if you live in a city with a certain kind of politics in the US, that will apply to you. But if you don't, it won't, right? And then at the federal level, it depends on who's in power. So it becomes less sticky at the overall level, but you'll have these pockets that are making things greener. And that's count for something.
Yeah.
Hopefully over time, the economic case just becomes like self-sufficient, where you don't need regulation. It's just like, why would I buy the more expensive thing that people don't want? I can buy this thing that might be in the same price or even a little cheaper and becomes part of my marketing materials. And all of a sudden I can charge a premium for rental in this building.
Well, I was hoping actually for listeners who may want to know a little more about your own background, if you can just talk a little bit about where you come from, both professionally, but also personally. What has it been like in terms of your experience as an immigrant and an Arab working in this space in the US?
Yeah, totally. So I was born and raised in Syria. I did all my schooling there up until I finished high school, where in 2010, I decided to apply to colleges in the US. So there was this negotiation with my parents where I was like, okay, I'm just going to apply to schools who get full financial aid to international students, which is not that many. And then I'll only end up applying like the top 2 or 3 of those. So I only ended up applying to Harvard and Yale. I got into Harvard full ride, which worked out pretty well. Pretty thankful. All you need is one acceptance in some cases. So came here in 2011, knew I liked science. I didn't know what kind of science. So I took all the intro science classes my freshman year, physics, math, chemistry, biology. And I was like, wow, I just took all these science classes, but what can they count for? Like, what's the one major they could all contribute to? And it's like, oh wait, bioengineering sounds cool. It's super interdisciplinary. I get to use sort of all these concepts from all these different kinds of sciences. So I ended up studying bioengineering at Harvard. As an undergrad, I worked for 2 years at an organ regeneration lab where we're trying to use stem cells that were derived from regular tissue, which was a new technology at the time, to improve organ transplant rates. Sounds super cool, sort of conceptually, right? Like we're trying to grow organs in lab. The day-to-day was just pipetting ad nauseum and then going to a dark microscope room and counting cells on a screen, which I realized that I couldn't see myself doing for much longer. So junior year, I said, okay, I like science, maybe not PhD like science, but conceptually it makes a lot of sense. Maybe I should go and explore not how you develop new technology, but how you actually get it to market. So I ended up joining McKinsey in Boston for 3 years out of college.
And so for listeners who may not be as familiar with McKinsey.
Yeah, McKinsey is a consulting firm, global, within reach, serves customers and clients across most major sectors of the global economy. It's been great training for me. I met some really cool people there, including my current boss, Jackie Chin, who was a associate partner at McKinsey. We worked briefly together there. And then she left McKinsey to Suffolk Construction to start a data and analytics team. Both my parents are architects. My grandfather used to be a contractor in the Middle East way back in the day. We're catching up 6 months into her new role. She's telling me about all these data scientists she's hiring and all this newly available data construction. I was like, this is really cool. Are you hiring? A couple months later, I was on her team. So I started at Suffolk Construction, actually, working with the data science and data engineering teams, trying to do some foundational work, like build the company's first data lake, some analyses off of that. And 6 months to a year in, we realized that we have enough data to do some very proprietary things that are very specific to the way Suffolk manages on sites. And we viewed those as competitive and a big differentiation on the market. But there's so much else that can be done that is not as proprietary and that can just push the entire ecosystem forward, like predictive safety. That also requires massive amounts of data that no one contractor has because of how fragmented the industry is and how recent digitization is in the industry as well. So that's when we started thinking about, well, what's the best position entity to go and capture all that data and actually build tools on top of it. We're like, startups. Well, if you're telling startups to go and do all these cool things, you better have skin in the game and also make sure that these startups are set up to succeed. That was really the genesis of Suffolk Tech. We recognize all these problems, recognize that now is the time to go and solve them. Let's invest in companies doing that. And let's be as helpful as possible while also being as institutional as we can in the way that we invest and that we support our companies. Fast forward to today, we have a portfolio of about a dozen companies. We've invested for everything from pre-revenue all the way to pre-IPO, and our founders are killing it, which makes me very happy.
That's awesome. Have you faced, any particular situations where you're like, if I didn't have some, this sort of background, if I didn't have this sort of network, it might have been hard for me to jump from place to place or end up in the current situation where you are now?
So do you, I mean, at the same time, though, I think what Drew was also getting at, though, is do you feel like there's a certain level of insularity within the industry? I mean, both like tech and also construction as well, of that some set of like old boys club aspect of if you look and are part of a certain group and you can break in, but if you aren't part of those groups, it's far more difficult for someone else starting out to try to be a part of it.
Right. I think venture in general is an old boys club. And I think venture as a category is increasingly aware of that. And a lot of people are trying to bring both women and other minorities from other underrepresented backgrounds into the industry. Because to your point, it sort of relatively still a niche. And it's not like consulting or banking or any of these other jobs where you have large corporations running very standard interview processes, bringing in classes of analysts to rotations like every year. You have 2 or 3 people raising a fund. And then as they raise more and more money, they need more hands on deck and they just need to fill the 1 position or the 2 position. So structurally, it's been very much people hiring from their network. People are now realizing that, well, all my networks are people who look like me. That's bad. Or at least I'm missing out on very diverse perspectives that can help us as a group be much better. And there's this other talent pool out there that I just haven't tapped because I don't know enough people there. So let me go and act on it. Construction technology investing in particular is like a niche within a niche, right? So on the one hand, we all kind of know each other. It's very collaborative at the investor level. On the other hand, it's a lot of people look at me for better or worse, and I'm very white passing, also for better or worse. And everybody always talks about, okay, how do we bring more women to investing, venture investing, which doesn't have enough, but also construction and real estate, which also doesn't have enough women. And then how do you bring other folks who are Black, brown, LGBTQ, native, who also may look at the industry, both construction and investing, and look at both and say, nobody here looks like me. What am I doing here? So that's an active conversation. I think we all should do better. And I think we're missing out on a massive talent pool. So we have to.
Is that where, skills or talent can bridge the gap, or is it really a network, like who you know kind of thing?
I think it's both. So if I were giving advice to people looking to break into venture, I think skill is almost a must-have. You need to show deep, genuine interest in both venture and whichever asset class you're investing in, right? In as much as you track startups, you flag opportunities to folks in the industry, you gain their trust. And then that basically leads to network, right? They need to know who you are. You go and you post a job for any venture fund, you get thousands of applications and they're all super strong. How do you differentiate between those, right? So as somebody trying to break in, what events do you need to go to? What sort of founders you need to be able to help, who can go and tell the story of like, so-and-so is actually very helpful. They helped me meet X, Y, and Z. They put me to this customer reference, whatever it is, and start building that personal brand and have those stories that somebody can point and say, like, this is actually not a random person fresh out of college trying to break the industry alongside with like a few thousand people. This is someone who's actually very interested and they've tried to do or have done X, Y, and Z. And the interest there is genuine. Because once you're in a venture fund, somebody's taking a multi-year risk on you in a way. They're going to be able to work with you, train you, get you to be productive, and that you're going to like it, right? So as much as they can see signs that you're going to like it and hopefully you're going to do well, that goes a long way.
I think our final question really is a little more meta. This podcast is called How Tech Becomes Law. And so given your experience, how have you seen technology or its design impact the way that society operates?
That's a very deep meta question. I think sort of architecture, when I say architecture, I mean not just the way we design an apartment or a building, but an urban setting more broadly, influences the way we as people interact with each other extremely meaningfully. What we're seeing today is a push towards generative design, where you can say, given parameters X, Y, and Z, give me a building that meets all of them, or give me the sets of buildings, designs that meets all of them. The natural extension of that is to say, okay, I'm not just optimizing for a certain number of floors or a certain financial forecast. Give me a hospital floor design that optimizes a nurse's schedule, where they're not wasting 15 minutes going from their room to the first patient bed, another 15 minutes back. And that's half an hour a day. It adds up over time. give me a design that optimizes the way my marketing team works in this space versus the way my sales team works in that space. Give me a design where, like cul-de-sac, again, really creates a much more collaborative, social, car-free environment for everybody who lives in this big space, in this big block, can interact with each other. When I think about the built environment and new technologies influencing it, I think the way we design buildings with more people in mind and the way we can open up new possibilities using algorithms to say, here's a novel way of imagining this space, imagining this building that not just optimizes for the financial flows, but actually optimizes for the people experience will be very interesting. I don't know what the hospital of the future looks like, but I sure hope it's going to be designed by an algorithm. And a lot of architects might disagree with that, but they'll be the ones directing the algorithm, picking the right one. So it's all on them.
Well, thank you so much, Raja, for joining. And thank you so much for listening. I'm Dhruv Gupta with Jinyan Zhang, and this was How Tech Becomes Law.
Thanks for listening to How Tech Becomes Law. We are supported by the Public Interest Tech Lab. You can find us online at howtechbecomeslaw.org and on social media channels at Tech Becomes Law. The music for this podcast was produced by Clarence Yap. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. It really helps other listeners discover us. Thanks again for listening, and come back next week for another conversation on how tech becomes law.